My name is Catherine Elfrida Ashford. I used to believe that family was a fortress until the night mind tried to poison me with a $5,000 bottle of Bordeaux. My own mother handed me the glass. My father watched me drink it. And my brother? He just waited for the money to transfer. $33 million. That's all I was worth to them. I was their daughter, a decorated officer, a graduate of West Point. But to them, I was a problem that needed erasing. That night, I died in their eyes. But they had no idea who they were trying to kill. I wasn't born to inherit their legacy. I was born to end it. And I did, piece by piece. Before we dive into this true story of betrayal, war, and justice, I want to know, where are you watching from and how old are you? Make sure to subscribe to Subtle Revenge Stories for more tales that hit straight to the soul. The glass of wine looked like any other, deep ruby red, swirling gently in the crystal as my mother held it out with her usual elegant smile. "To the future of our family," she said softly, her voice a satin ribbon wrapped around something sharp. I took it with steady hands. Years in the army had trained me to hold composure under pressure, but nothing had prepared me for the moment your own mother tries to kill you and smiles while doing it. My father didn't even look at me. He just stared into the fire, silent and stone-like. Tristan, my younger brother, picked at his food like a bored child at a state dinner. The table was set for 15, each guest carefully selected from Washington's elite senators, generals, defense contractors. And I was the daughter who had spent her life earning every damn stripe on her uniform, only to be treated like the help. I raised the glass. Not to drink, but to study it. Something was off. There was a smell beneath the wine's rich bouquet. A hint of something metallic, almost bitter. My tongue touched the rim barely, and I felt it immediately. A heat unnatural, sharp, chemical. My body reacted faster than my thoughts, the years of tactical training in me screaming from somewhere deep. I set the glass down carefully, trying not to reveal the chill running down my spine. I glanced at my mother. Her smile didn't falter. I looked at my father, still unmoved. Tristan was texting under the table. The world around me slowed, thickened. It hit me then, this wasn't a toast. This was a trap. An execution masked in velvet and wine. I should have known. The years had taught me that I was tolerated, not loved. Praised only when it benefited the family name. Used when things went wrong. Forgotten when they went right. My father had once said, "A legacy needs softness, not a blade." And that's all I had ever been to him, a blade forged too sharp, too precise. The wrong kind of child for the Ashford dynasty. That night, I wasn't their daughter. I was a problem. A loose end standing in the way of a $33 million inheritance. And this wine was their solution. They didn't see me as a threat. That was their mistake. They saw a pawn. I was a soldier. And even soldiers learn how to outmaneuver generals. But tell me, have you ever looked into your mother's eyes and realized she would rather see you dead than successful? Have you ever been treated like a burden in the very home you helped build? Let me know, because that's where this story begins. Not with the wine, but with what I chose to do after I survived it. I wish I could tell you I flipped the table, that I stormed out, that I confronted them right then and there. But I didn't. That's not what soldiers do in hostile territory. We observe, we assess, we survive. I sat through the rest of that dinner with the poison still burning faintly on my lips, pretending to sip, pretending to smile. The room pulsed with polite conversation and polished silverware. No one noticed that my hand trembled slightly beneath the linen napkin. Not even when my breath hitched. Not even when I wiped the corner of my mouth and my fingertips came away with the faintest trace of red. Not wine. Blood. As dessert was served, chocolate souffle with a hint of raspberry, my mother leaned in closer. "You've always been so independent, Catherine," she whispered like it was a compliment. Too much so. She dabbed her napkin, folded it perfectly, then turned to the senator on her left, her attention shifting like the wind. Just a momentary acknowledgement of the daughter she had tried to erase. I knew then with bone-deep clarity that everything that followed from this night forward was deliberate. They weren't acting on impulse. This wasn't a mistake. It was a sanctioned removal, a family-approved operation. My mind spiraled back to the moment my father said, "A legacy needs softness, not a blade." And there it was, the truth that had always been hanging in the air like a smoke-filled curtain. They didn't see me as one of them. I was an asset when they needed me, a liability when they didn't. I was the daughter who had fought in uniform, led operations, bled in silence, but none of that mattered. Because I wasn't their golden son. I wasn't Tristan. He didn't need to earn respect. It was handed to him plated in silver and wrapped in blind loyalty. And me, I was just the placeholder, the distraction, the burden that made him look better in comparison. As the plates were cleared and the last of the wine disappeared into polished glasses, I heard my mother's voice, sharp and purposeful. "We've done everything for her. Everything. But she still insists on being difficult." That word hung in the air. Difficult. I wasn't difficult. I was disobedient. I wasn't weak enough to be controlled. That's what scared them. And when people like my parents feel threatened, they don't confront you, they erase you. Tell me, has your family ever made you feel like your success was a threat? Like the more you achieved, the more they resented you for it? Because sitting at that table in the house I grew up in, I realized something that chilled me more than the poison ever could. I was no longer part of the Ashford family. I was their enemy. And they were at war with me before I even knew the battlefield had changed. The first real sign that something was deeply wrong came when my vision blurred, not suddenly, but like fog creeping in over a calm field. It started at the edges, soft and deceptive like sleep trying to pull me under. My hands went numb next. I blinked hard, adjusted my posture, and tried to focus on the chandelier above the table, its hundreds of tiny crystals shimmering like distant stars. That's when the sound around me began to change. The voices at the table, once sharp and distinct, now sounded muffled, like I was underwater. My body was failing me, but my mind, my training held. I clutched the armrest of my chair and forced my gaze upward. My mother was watching me, her smile tight, unmoving. My father raised his wine glass and stared at it, contemplative, distant, not at me. Not even to hide the truth, because he no longer needed to. My brother leaned back, hands folded behind his head as if he had just finished a job well done. And in that stillness, something inside me broke, not with pain, not with fear, but with realization. This wasn't symbolic. This wasn't subtle. This was it. This was how they planned to end me. Not with scandal or confrontation, but with a quiet, undignified fade into nothing. Poisoned. Forgotten. I tried to rise, but my legs refused. The room twisted around me like a carousel of lies and laughter. Someone said something about the soufflé being too bitter. Another laughed politely. I tasted metal. My throat burned. A hand reached for mine, it was my mother's. And she whispered, "It's better this way." My blood chilled. Better for whom better, because they no longer had to pretend I mattered. Better because $33 million could now flow freely into the hands of their favorite child. My mind screamed for action, but my body betrayed me. I could hear Serafina's voice, stripped of all performance now. Everything has been arranged. I watched her lips move through the haze. Tristan will handle the Belgium matter? My father added she was always unpredictable. A necessary correction. And that was when it hit me fully, I wasn't their daughter. I was a tactical flaw. A variable. Something to adjust like a spreadsheet error. And tonight was their adjustment. The wine glass slipped from my hand and shattered its deep red contents, staining the white tablecloth like blood spilled on snow. I slumped back, every nerve screaming. But my last clear thought before the blackness took me wasn't fear, it was rage. Pure, silent rage. Because they didn't try to kill a stranger. They tried to kill me. Their blood. Their soldier. And they did it with full awareness, full intent, and no remorse. But here's a question for you. What would hurt more? A stranger turning against you, or the people who once tucked you into bed at night deciding your death would be more convenient? I woke to darkness. Not the soft kind you ease into after a long day, but a thick, smothering black that pressed down on my skin like wet wool. My head throbbed with a slow, rhythmic pain like a hammer striking steel at regular intervals. The floor beneath me was cold, unforgiving stone. Moisture had soaked through my clothes. I smelled mold, rotting wood, and something faintly metallic old blood. My first instinct was to move, but even that felt foreign. My limbs were sluggish, my stomach twisting in waves of nausea. I tried to speak, but only a hoarse rasp escaped. No one answered. Of course they didn't. It took me a moment to realize where I was. The scent of old oak barrels, the damp chill, the faint echo of dripping water. It was the Ashford wine cellar. The one beneath the east wing. I hadn't been down there in years. That's where they dumped me. Not in a hospital. Not in a grave. Just in the dark. As if I was expired inventory. My jacket, my phone, my watch gone. Stripped of identity, stripped of dignity. They didn't even bother to lock a door. Why would they? They thought I wouldn't last the night. I sat up slowly, every joint screaming. But the pain was grounding. Real. Unlike their lies. I closed my eyes and forced myself to breathe. Deep, tactical breaths. West Point taught us many things, but the most vital lesson: panic is a luxury. Emotion is dead weight. I couldn't afford either. I began a checklist in my head: injuries, orientation, location, threats. I was compromised, no doubt, but I wasn't helpless. I crawled to the far wall, letting my hands guide me through the dark. Each stone was slick with age. I searched for anything: an edge, a tool, a crack. That's when my fingers touched something cold, metal, and round. I froze. The weight, the feel of it, I knew it instantly. My father's old challenge coin. The one he gave me when I graduated West Point, pressed into my palm like a symbol of approval. I remember how proud I'd felt back then. How foolish. They must have dropped it when they dragged me down here. To them, it was just a trinket. But to me in that moment, it became something more. It became proof. Proof that I had once meant something, even to a man who now wanted me dead. I clutched it so hard the milled edges bit into my palm. And in that pain, I found clarity. Tell me this: have you ever had to remind yourself in the dark who you really are? Have you ever clung to a tiny scrap of identity while everything else was taken from you? Because lying there on the cold stone floor of my family's cellar, I stopped being Catherine the daughter. I became Catherine the soldier. Not buried. Not broken. Just waiting. The coin became more than metal in my hand. It became memory. Not of childhood warmth or holiday dinners, but of every battle I had survived. The Afghan sandstorms, the night raids, the screams of men in pain, and the silence of those who never came back. I wasn't built for comfort. I was built for crisis. And this cellar, this betrayal, this poisoning, this wasn't my end. It was my beginning. I dragged myself to my knees, pushing past the nausea, the dizziness, the waves of cold that clung to me like sweat. My breathing was shallow but controlled. The coin's sharp edge had drawn blood. I welcomed it. Pain was real. Pain was power. My fingers searched the wall again, inch by inch. And finally, there it was, a narrow metal grate, rusted and old, barely bigger than my shoulders. A forgotten ventilation shaft. I almost laughed. My family, for all their cunning, had overlooked one crucial detail I had trained for escape behind enemy lines. They thought they had buried a daughter. but what they buried was a combat strategist. I took the coin, wedged its edge into the first rusted screw, and twisted. It didn't move at first. I gritted my teeth. Again. Harder. The metal groaned, and with that sound, something inside me snapped into focus. One screw for the strategy they stole from me when I was 14. Another for the $5,000 check they guilted me into giving up when I won that science prize at 16. Another for the thesis my brother plagiarized at 30. Another for the wine. Every slow, agonizing turn of that coin was a vow. They would regret leaving me alive. They thought they had taken everything: my records, my money, my identity. But what they didn't take was my will. That's the one thing you can't poison or forge. My shoulders screamed as I pried loose the last screw. I yanked the grate free and stared into the narrow shaft. It was dark, cold, unknown. But so was war. And I had walked into worse. I crawled inside the stone, tearing at my skin. My boots scraped my arms, shook, but I kept going. I emerged into the humid, moonlit grass behind the estate, gasping like a reborn thing covered in dirt, blood, and old wine. I didn't look back. Not at the mansion. Not at the people inside it. Not at the life I had just crawled out of. I vanished into the night like a ghost they thought they had buried. But I was coming back with proof, with names, with everything they thought they had erased. Let me ask you something. If the very people who raised you tried to kill you in silence, would you scream? Or would you rise and make them hear you through action? Because I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I walked mile after mile into the dark with nothing but a coin in my fist and a war plan forming in my mind. I didn't walk away from that estate. I extracted myself from a battlefield. My legs carried me like memory, not strength, down gravel roads and into the shadows of the Virginia countryside. The night air was thick with pine and silence. I had no destination, no map, no supplies. But I had my mind. And my mind was sharp enough to cut through the fog of betrayal they wrapped around me. My clothes were damp and stained. My body ached with the slow aftermath of poison. I stopped only once, crouching by the edge of a ditch, retching up what was left of my last meal. My vision pulsed in and out. Still, I kept moving. By dawn, I reached the outskirts of Baltimore, a city that smelled of diesel, damp brick, and anonymity. I was alone, and I needed to stay that way. There was a pawn shop near the bus terminal, dingy, fluorescent lit, and reeking of dust and desperation. I stepped inside and pulled the only asset they hadn't stolen from me, my West Point graduation watch. Titanium. Engraved on the back duty. Honor. Country. The man behind the counter looked at me like I was trouble or maybe just a junkie. He didn't recognize the watch's worth. He saw only my unwashed face and trembling fingers. He offered me $150. I took it. That money bought me a pair of jeans, a plain hoodie from a secondhand store, and a room at a roadside motel where the walls were thin and the bed sagged in the middle. I didn't care. It had a lock. It had running water, and it had silence. That evening, I sat on the edge of that worn bed, spooning cold chicken noodle soup from a dented can, and staring at the muted television in the corner. And there she was, my mother, Serafina Ashford, smiling, polished, speaking at a charity gala as though she hadn't just tried to murder her daughter. "It is our duty," she said, her voice smooth as silk, "to protect our family legacy and care for those less fortunate." I stared at the screen, a spoon halfway to my lips. The hypocrisy was so thick I could taste it. They had moved on without missing a beat. No scandal. No suspicion. Just the graceful illusion of control. The world didn't know I had vanished. And that was the most terrifying part. They didn't need me gone publicly. They needed me erased, quietly. I stared at her face, her perfectly sculpted image. And I made a promise not to expose her, not to embarrass her, but to dismantle everything she stood for. Brick by gilded brick. Because, tell me, have you ever watched someone smile for the cameras while your body was still aching from their betrayal? Have you ever seen your attempted murderer praised for compassion on national television? I have. And that's when I knew. This war wasn't over. It had just changed shape. I didn't sleep that night. Not because of fear, but because my mind wouldn't stop calculating. Everything I'd been trained to do, analyze risk, assess terrain, identify threat vectors, it all kicked in with brutal clarity. The poison had taken my strength. My family had taken my name. But what they couldn't take was my discipline. I wasn't going to fight them with emotion. I was going to fight them like a soldier. At 0700, I walked to the Baltimore Public Library. I needed quiet stability and, most of all, information. The smell of old books and dust settled me in a way no hotel ever could. I spent hours among the shelves not reading for pleasure, but for mental oxygen. Strategy, case law, encrypted communication methods I scanned and absorbed. I needed to find a way to act without being detected, without alerting my father's network. And if you've never had to plan a counteroffensive in the same clothes you nearly died in, you don't know what resolve feels like. But I couldn't do it alone. I needed someone I could trust. Someone who owed my father nothing. Someone who still believed in honor. I thought of one name, Colonel Xavier Thorne, my former commanding officer in Afghanistan. A man who once told me, "If you're ever in real trouble, don't scream. Send signal." I still remembered the phrase we'd agreed on during a winter mission gone sideways. Fortress compromised. That's all it would take. I walked to a corner store, bought a cheap burner phone with the last of my cash, and stood outside staring at the keypad. My thumb hovered over the digits. What if he didn't believe me? What if he was part of it? What if they had already gotten to him? But then I reminded myself fear was their currency. And I wasn't spending another damn dime on it. I typed the message. Just 2 words. Fortress compromised. I hit send and waited. Have you ever waited to find out if your entire life will collapse or be saved by a single reply? That's what it felt like standing outside that store, like the next few minutes would determine whether I stayed a ghost or became a weapon. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. And just as I started to walk back toward the motel, the phone buzzed. Unknown number. A single text report, your situation major. Relief hit me like a wave. Not because I was safe, but because someone believed me. Someone who mattered. Someone with power and principle. I called him, hands shaking. His voice answered, calm, steady, familiar. Go ahead. And I did. I laid it all out, the poisoning, the trust fund, the deleted records, the wine cellar. He didn't interrupt. He didn't doubt. He listened like a man preparing for war. Tell me this, have you ever had someone believe you, without proof, without hesitation, because that belief is a lifeline. And in that moment, Xavier Thorne threw me one. He said 6 words that pierced through the noise, the fear, the trauma. You are not alone, Catherine. And for the first time since I collapsed at that dinner table, I believed him. Colonel Thorne didn't ask follow-up questions meant to cast doubt. He didn't try to calm me down. He didn't ask if I had imagined it all. Instead, his voice took on the precise rhythm of military protocol. Activate sanctuary protocol. Go dark. Stay in place. I'll coordinate from here. And just like that, the war room that used to exist only in my mind started becoming real. The words felt like oxygen, sharp, cold, and necessary. Within hours, a car appeared outside the motel, a civilian vehicle with tags registered to a fictitious company. The driver never made eye contact, never asked questions. He handed me a clean duffel bag with clothes in my size, a plain envelope with new IDs, and a burner tablet encrypted with one-time authentication. I changed in the motel bathroom, washed my face in the cracked mirror, and saw something I hadn't seen in years. My own eyes not clouded by the approval of others, not masked by duty. Just me. Hardened. Awake. The car took me northwest deep into Maryland. We stopped at a nondescript cottage nestled against a wall of trees surrounded by nothing but silence and sky. A safe house. No signals. No traceable utilities. just thick walls and cameras set to record only internally. I entered without hesitation. I had slept in tents in Kandahar with mortars echoing in the distance. Silence for me was not peace, it was readiness. That night, I sat at the wooden table in the cottage's main room, reviewing every scrap of memory like it was intelligence. Their words, their expressions, the timing, the wine, the check Tristan had mentioned years ago about Belgium. My mother's smug silence. I pulled it all together into an internal operations file. Names, motives, means. There was no mystery anymore. They had tried to kill me to cover a larger crime. And the $33 million that wasn't inheritance. It was a shield. Money meant to plug a hole they were terrified would leak. The next morning, Thorne called. His voice was quieter, colder. "They're not just trying to eliminate you, Catherine," he said. "They're trying to erase you." I froze. "Someone with deep-level clearance accessed your military file last night. Your official record now states that you suffered a psychological breakdown and went AWOL." I said nothing. I didn't have to. That silence, his and mine, was the kind soldiers know. The kind that precedes impact. "They're building a story," he continued. "A neat, pathetic tragedy about a woman who couldn't handle the pressure. It wasn't just about killing me physically. They wanted to kill my legacy. Strip my record. Turn every ribbon on my chest into a lie. And if they succeeded, I wouldn't just be gone. I'd be forgotten. Tell me, have you ever felt your own identity being rewritten by someone else's hand? Like your entire life, every scar, every sacrifice was being edited out of existence because I felt it. And I wasn't going to let it stand. The next morning, Thorne sent me a secure link with a single sentence. "Watch this." All of it. I clicked. It was a live broadcast of a popular national morning show. Bright set, warm colors, gentle piano music in the background, the kind that makes Americans feel safe with their coffee. And then they appeared. My family. My mother in a navy silk dress, eyes glistening with rehearsed sorrow. Tristan in a charcoal suit, his tie slightly loosened like he hadn't slept just enough to look human. They were being interviewed as the grieving Ashfords, a family seeking their missing daughter. "She's always struggled," Tristan said, voice thick like he was swallowing tears. "So much pressure. Always comparing herself to me." His fingers trembled as he pulled out a photo of me in uniform. "We just want her home. Safe. No matter what." He was so convincing I might have believed him if I hadn't tasted the poison myself. Serafina placed a hand on his arm, her voice a whisper. She was brilliant. So gifted. But sometimes, the brightest candles burn too fast. Her smile was fragile but perfectly timed. A mother devastated but holding strong. I stared at the screen in disbelief. They weren't just covering their tracks. They were rewriting the narrative entirely. The soldier who had served her country for over a decade was now a jealous, unstable sister who had buckled under pressure and wandered off into the unknown. This wasn't damage control. This was erasure disguised as concern. It was public theater, and the world was buying front-row seats. Social media comments poured in, sympathizing with the heroic family and praying for my recovery. The public had no idea they were offering condolences to my attempted murderers. I shut the laptop slowly, my breath steady but my hands clenched. They had turned the dagger deeper and worse, they'd twisted it in full view of the nation. And yet, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I recalibrated. They wanted to make me look like I'd vanished into madness. Then I would reappear with truth sharp enough to tear through their lies. That evening, I sat in the safe house kitchen under flickering fluorescent light, the coins still in my pocket, warm from my grip. And I started to plan. This wouldn't be revenge by spectacle. No public meltdowns. No cameras shoved into their faces. This would be justice by precision. By evidence. By the truth they thought they buried. But before I acted, I needed to ask something. Not to anyone else, but to myself. Because maybe you've asked it too after your truth was twisted. If they've already convinced the world you're crazy, is it worth fighting to prove them wrong? I stared at my own reflection in the black glass of the turned-off television. My eyes were tired, but there was something behind them, steel, not shame. And that's when I knew. This war wouldn't be won by rage. It would be won by control. I didn't waste time mourning my stolen reputation. I'd seen what sentimentality cost on the battlefield. It wasn't sorrow that burned inside me, it was focus. Cold, measured, and precise. They had laid their groundwork spinning the tale of the mentally unstable daughter, the ungrateful officer, the jealous sister. And while the world was still applauding their performance, I was building my counterstrike. I needed someone who could help me reclaim the truth, someone outside their reach, but inside the system. I thought back to my years at the Pentagon. There was one person who had impressed me not with rank or pedigree, but with integrity. Corporal Anna Chararma. A quiet records specialist, sharp as a scalpel, invisible in a room until you needed answers no one else could find. I had mentored her once, pushed her to pursue cryptographic analysis. She had potential. And more importantly, she had a spine. I reached out through a secure channel. No names, only encryption. My message was simple. Need records. Altered. Illegal. Will explain. You choose. Her reply came 5 minutes later. Major, I never believed the AWOL report. Tell me what you need. That message hit me harder than any punch I'd taken in the army. She didn't ask for proof. She didn't hesitate. She trusted the version of me she had known, not the version the world was fed. I sent her a list of identifiers, directives, and hidden file markers I knew the Ashfords couldn't have fully scrubbed. She responded with precision, navigating the digital back alleys of the Pentagon's data vaults like a ghost. 2 days later, I received 2 encrypted files. One was the original trust charter, digitally timestamped and legally binding. It named me, the real me, as the sole beneficiary of the $33 million. Any changes required my explicit consent. I had given none. The second file made my blood run cold. It was an internal Army investigation buried so deep it might as well have been classified. It detailed a live-fire training accident during Tristan's last deployment. Due to gross negligence and failure to follow protocol, he had nearly gotten his entire platoon killed. The recommendation, court-martial. The result, suppressed. The reason, a directive from the highest level, my father. As I read the final page, my stomach twisted. Attached to the file was a citation form awarding Tristan the Bronze Star for that same operation. The very event he should have been discharged for had been twisted into a badge of heroism. It wasn't just a lie. It was stolen valor. A slap in the face to every soldier who had bled for real. I printed every page, spread them out across the floor. Documents that could dismantle legacies. This wasn't about clearing my name anymore. It was about restoring the meaning of everything I had ever stood for. I looked down at the papers, then at my own reflection in the glass pane of the safe house door. I didn't see a victim. I saw a strategist. And this was just the beginning of my counteroffensive. I stared at the trust document, and the buried investigation report spread across the floor of the safe house like battle plans. Each line of text was a blow to their facade. Each time-stamped signature a nail in their legacy's coffin. I didn't tremble. I didn't cry. I strategized. My war was no longer just survival. It was justice. Tactical, surgical, final. I called Thorne. He answered on the first ring. Talk to me, he said. I did brief, factual, mission-focused. I have the unaltered trust. I have the suppressed court-martial recommendation. And I have proof your Bronze Star recipient almost got his men killed. There was a pause, not out of disbelief, but consideration. Then we need a lawyer who doesn't flinch at the sight of generals. And that's how Evelyn Reed entered the operation. She wasn't what people expected from a courtroom weapon. No dramatic flair, no loud declarations. She was calm, lethal, and efficient. A former Army JAG prosecutor who'd left the military to start her own firm, quietly dismantling political and financial giants one sealed deposition at a time. We met in a temporary workspace that looked more like a field command post than a law office, whiteboards covered in timelines, monitors streaming encrypted data, her desk bare, except for a legal pad and black coffee. She let me speak uninterrupted. I laid it all out, every betrayal, every forgery, every lie. She didn't blink. When I was done, she didn't offer pity. She offered a plan. "We don't argue emotion," she said, tapping her pen. "We argue violation. We don't sue them for pain. We gut them for fraud." She circled one word on the legal pad: conspiracy. She walked to the whiteboard, drew 3 circles. Ashford Industries DoD access points. Belgium real estate shell funds. "Your father's mistake was thinking this was personal. It isn't. This is federal. This is criminal." Her voice never rose, but every word cut clean. "We don't bring down their name with tears. We do it with receipts." That night, we began assembling the team. Thorne brought in former military intelligence analysts, data security experts, and a forensic accountant who had once cracked open a senator's offshore empire using just 2 wire transfers and a golf club membership list. We weren't building a case. We were constructing an airstrike, one that wouldn't just hit their reputation, but would vaporize the entire foundation they stood on. I stood back watching it unfold. I had always fought my battles alone. But now, for the first time, I wasn't the lone soldier on the hill. I had a unit again. One not born from blood or birthright, but from loyalty, purpose, and principle. And let me ask you something, if you had one chance to expose the people who tried to erase you, would you take it, even if it meant putting yourself back in their line of fire? Because I was ready. I wasn't just returning to the fight. I was drawing the map for their downfall. And this time, I wasn't walking in alone. His name had come up once in a whispered briefing years ago: Elias Vance, former CFO of Ashford Industries. Quiet, brilliant, and abruptly dismissed 5 years prior with little explanation. At the time, I thought it was just a corporate reshuffle. Now, with the documents Anna uncovered and Evelyn's cross-referenced intel, I knew better. Elias had been the first casualty of my father's internal war. A man who dug too deep, asked too many questions, and paid for it with his career. Thorne tracked him down to a weather-beaten house in rural Pennsylvania. No internet, no neighbors, curtains drawn with cardboard, the front yard overgrown. It wasn't exile, it was survival. I drove myself there. I didn't bring a team. I didn't bring a gun. Just a folder filled with truth and a hope that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't the only ghost who still wanted justice. He opened the door a crack when I knocked. Thin, pale, and twitching like a man who lived with fear as a roommate. "I can't help you," he whispered, already retreating. "You don't know what they're capable of." I didn't flinch. They poisoned me 2 weeks ago and buried me in a wine cellar. His eyes locked on mine. And for a moment, we weren't strangers. We were survivors. He let me in. The interior of his home was a bunker of paranoia. Foil on the windows, multiple deadbolts, papers stacked in labeled boxes. But behind the mess, there was method. Elias hadn't forgotten what he knew, he'd just buried it. I told him everything. I didn't hold back. As I spoke, I watched the fear in him shift into something else. Recognition. Rage. He told me his story in return. How he had found irregularities, millions routed into a secret offshore account labeled Belgium contingency. How when he brought it to my father, he was told to adjust his expectations. When he refused, his accounts were frozen. His reputation smeared, his wife terrorized with anonymous calls until her heart gave out from the stress. Her name was Maria. She was 52, and she died because he tried to tell the truth. "I kept a copy," he said, standing slowly. He thought he'd destroyed everything. But I kept a copy. He walked to the wall, pressed on a hidden panel, and retrieved a small black hard drive encrypted and sealed. "If I disappear, this goes public. But if I give it to you, this becomes war." I took it without hesitation. Have you ever held something in your hand that felt heavier than its weight? That hard drive wasn't just evidence. It was a loaded weapon. Proof of fraud, bribery, offshore laundering, all tied to the Ashford name. They needed my $33 million not to build wealth, but to plug holes in a sinking empire of lies. They thought they could kill me and bury their secrets. But they left one piece behind. Me. Back in Arlington, Evelyn's war room came alive like a military command center. The moment I handed her Elias Vance's encrypted hard drive, the energy shifted. The room, once humming with controlled focus, now vibrated with purpose. This wasn't theory anymore. We had the payload. It was time to decode and deploy. Our cyber forensics expert, Dorian ex-NSA Drywit caffeine addict, plugged the drive in without a word. Military-grade encryption, he muttered. Someone was paranoid. I smiled. He had reason to be. It took 2 hours to breach the first layer, and once we were in the screen, lit up with a structure so complex it looked more like a map of a foreign city than a financial network. Shell corporations, proxy transfers, Swiss bank codes, and buried beneath it all transaction logs tied directly to Ashford Industries' Tristan's gambling debts and a chain of illegal payments routed through Belgium's Ministry of Defense. Evelyn stood behind Dorian, arms folded, eyes cold. This isn't just fraud. This is federal procurement abuse. Possibly treason if foreign officials are involved. Her voice dropped a notch. We don't just have leverage, Catherine. We have the power to dismantle everything they built. I leaned against the table, watching the data unfold. Every email, every wire transfer, every cover-up, they weren't just numbers on a screen. They were pieces of me. Every sleepless night on deployment while Tristan was blowing tens of thousands in Monte Carlo. Every moment my father told me to be less sharp while laundering government money through dummy defense contracts. Every time my mother said Tristan's under pressure while I bled for a country they were quietly betraying. This wasn't just personal anymore. This was patriotic. And they had crossed a line that no uniform could ignore. Evelyn briefed us like a commander before an operation. We're building a multi-pronged assault, financial records to the DOJ, trust violations to federal court, military fraud to the Pentagon IG. But first we need to verify the chain of ownership. That's where I came in. For hours I pored over contract headers, flagging my father's digital signatures, connecting timestamps, locating missing initials that could tie him to every illegal move. I was no longer the daughter in exile. I was the analyst at the center of a takedown. Each link I confirmed was like tightening a noose, only this time the rope wasn't around my neck. It was around theirs. And let me ask you, if you held the truth in your hands, proof that could ruin the people who tried to destroy you, would you wait for the perfect moment to strike? Or would you pull the trigger and let the world burn? I didn't want flames. I wanted structure collapse, quiet, precise, undeniable. They thought I was the problem. But now, I was the reckoning. And their own numbers would bury them. The financial records were damning, but I knew Evelyn was right. We needed more. A pattern of corruption wasn't enough. We had to dismantle the story they built around Tristan, around me, and prove beyond reasonable doubt that their entire image was fabricated. That required going back into the one place I had spent my life serving, and where they had now made me a ghost, the Pentagon. I couldn't go back physically, not yet. But I knew someone who could. Her name was Anna Chararma. I had mentored her when she was just a corporal, fresh out of training, navigating the bureaucracy with quiet intelligence and steel in her spine. I remembered her because she had never once looked for shortcuts. I reached out to her through the same encrypted channel I used before. I didn't need to give her the whole story. Just enough. My record's been tampered with. I need the original file, and anything tied to Tristan's last deployment. She responded in under 5 minutes. I remember when they said you went AWOL. It never felt right. I'm in. She worked fast, faster than I expected. 2 days later, Evelyn called me into the main room and handed me a secure tablet. Chararma delivered, she said simply. I opened the first file. It was the original, unaltered trust charter, black and white, stamped, time-stamped, digitally verified. I was and had always been the sole beneficiary. Any changes required my explicit written consent, which, of course, had never been given. Their attempt to transfer the assets to Tristan wasn't just immoral, it was illegal. But the second file shattered something deeper. It was an internal investigation suppressed regarding a live-fire training exercise during Tristan's last command. According to the findings, his refusal to follow protocol had put an entire platoon at risk. The investigators had recommended formal court-martial proceedings. Instead, a directive came down from a high-level official. The report was buried, and weeks later, I opened the final document. A commendation approval form for the Bronze Star awarded to Tristan for that very same operation. I felt my stomach turn. I remembered the ceremony. My parents' front row. My father's hand pinning the medal to Tristan's chest. My mother in tears. And now, with that paper in front of me, I realized what I had watched wasn't a celebration. It was a cover-up dressed in patriotism and applause. They had taken something sacred, something earned through blood sacrifice and valor, and used it to polish a lie. I had bled for my medals, and they had handed one to Tristan like a consolation prize. Tell me, have you ever watched someone receive honors for a victory they didn't earn? Have you stood silent while a fraud was treated like a hero and you were painted the villain? That's what they had done to me, but I wasn't silent anymore. And I wasn't going to wait for justice to come knocking. I was going to deliver it myself, one forged medal, one forged document at a time. I laid the final document on the table beside Evelyn. The original trust charter, the suppressed investigation, the fraudulent Bronze Star citation. She read each one in silence, her jaw tightening with every page. When she finished, she didn't speak right away. She just stared at the papers for a long moment before looking up at me. Her eyes held no sympathy, only precision. "We've got them," she said, voice quiet, clipped, lethal. "And we're going to take them apart, piece by piece." She stood, rolled back her sleeves, and tapped the whiteboard with the end of her pen. "The public case starts with civil litigation. The trust. That's our opening strike. But this," she gestured to the suppressed court-martial and the Bronze Star, "this goes to the Pentagon Inspector General and the Department of Defense Criminal Investigation Division. That's where we bring the military down on their heads." I nodded, my pulse steady. For the first time since that poisoned wine touched my lips, I didn't feel like I was running. I felt like I was moving forward, strategically, surgically, with intent. The courtroom wasn't a trap now. It was the battleground I'd chosen. And I wasn't walking in alone. I was going in with an arsenal of truth. Over the next 48 hours, our team worked around the clock. Evelyn drafted legal motions with surgical precision. Dorian compiled a digital chain of custody that would hold up under the scrutiny of a Senate committee. Our forensic accountant mapped every dollar from my trust fund through a series of shell companies and into Belgian real estate ventures so poorly managed they could only have been designed to fail. And at the center of it all, Tristan, the golden boy, the decorated lieutenant, the heir apparent, and the perfect puppet for a corrupt general and a mother who cared more about legacy than life. They had wrapped him in medals, propped him up on television, painted him as the grieving brother. But we had the brush now, and we were going to repaint the entire canvas with facts. I sat alone later that night, staring at my uniform laid out across the back of a chair. The one I hadn't worn since the night they tried to kill me. I ran my fingers over the fabric, every stitch a reminder of the oaths I had taken. Not to my family, not to some illusion of honor, but to the truth. Tell me, have you ever had to reclaim your identity from those who tried to rewrite it? Have you ever stood at the edge of a room, knowing that when you step inside, everything changes? Because that's where I was. The next time I faced my family, it wouldn't be across a dinner table. It would be across a courtroom. And I wouldn't be asking for answers. I'd be issuing consequences. The courthouse in Alexandria, Virginia looked more like a monument than a place where justice was dispensed. Columns of white stone, cold steps that carried the weight of 100 years of rulings. And on that morning it became the stage for a reckoning long overdue. Inside, the Ashfords were already seated front row naturally. My father wore his full dress uniform, his chest a mosaic of medals that no longer held any meaning. My mother sat beside him, perfectly composed, pearl earrings glinting under the lights. Tristan slouched next to them, bored and distracted as if none of this mattered. To them, it didn't. They thought the hearing was a formality, a nuisance, a matter to be dismissed quickly with a wave of influence and a smug nod. Their attorney, a man whose fees probably had 5 digits per hour, stood with confidence oozing from every syllable. "Your Honor," he said, gesturing toward the empty chair reserved for me, "we're here today on behalf of the Ashford family, in what is unfortunately a frivolous and deeply unfortunate situation. My clients have been subjected to slander, mental distress, and malicious intent from a troubled former officer." He paused, letting his voice linger. "A woman who, I might add, was declared absent without leave, suffering from mental instability and professional jealousy toward her brother, Lieutenant Tristan Ashford." The courtroom murmured, and then the doors opened. I stepped inside wearing my own Army service uniform. Immaculate, sharp, unapologetic. On my chest were the Legion of Merit, the Bronze Star, the Purple Heart. All earned, all real. The courtroom fell into a hush. The air shifted. Every eye turned. Every breath caught. My heels echoed on the polished tile as I walked the center aisle, slow, steady, unflinching. I didn't look at them. I didn't need to. I could feel their world cracking open from across the room. Evelyn Reed rose beside our table. "Your Honor," she said, calm and composed, "the defense is basing their motion to dismiss on the assumption that my client, Major Catherine Alfreda Ashford, is both mentally unfit and absent from duty. We respectfully submit declassified Pentagon logs showing that on the night in question, Major Ashford was leading a classified strategic briefing authenticated this morning by the Inspector General's office." An officer stepped forward and handed the judge the file. She opened it, scanned. Her brow furrowed. The defense lawyer faltered. My father's expression didn't shift, but the color in his face drained. My mother's fingers tightened around her clutch. Tristan just stared, silent, confused, exposed. And then Evelyn dropped the second bomb. "We'd also like to call our first witness, Mr. Elias Vance. Have you ever seen someone's entire world collapse in 5 seconds? Because that's what it looked like when Elias entered the courtroom, no longer a broken man in hiding, but a witness armed with facts." My father stood up, shouting an objection that the judge silenced with a single glare. I sat down and exhaled. Not in relief, in readiness. Because this was no longer survival. This was retribution. Elias Vance took the stand with the quiet resolve of a man who had buried too many truths for too long. No dramatics, no vengeance in his tone. Just facts, methodical, documented, undeniable. Evelyn guided him through his testimony like a surgeon with a scalpel, exposing layer after layer of rot beneath the Ashford legacy. He detailed the hidden accounts, the offshore laundering, the forged signatures. Every transaction. Every lie. Each revelation was like a hammer strike on marble, sharp, loud, irreversible. The room was dead silent. Not even a cough. No shifting in seats. Just the growing tension of an empire collapsing in real time. When Elias finished, Evelyn activated the courtroom monitors. What followed wasn't a case, it was an execution. Email chains, wire transfers, internal memos, photos of meetings, contracts linking Ashford Industries directly to fraudulent defense deals and ghost projects tied to Belgium. Documents that should have been buried forever now projected in high definition on government screens. The judge's knuckles whitened around her gavel, and Evelyn wasn't done. She held up 2 final exhibits, the unaltered trust charter and the suppressed military investigation. one proving I was the sole legal beneficiary, the other exposing Tristan's criminal negligence and fraudulent commendation. When the monitor displayed Tristan's Bronze Star approval signed weeks after a botched exercise nearly killed a dozen soldiers, a murmur of disgust rippled through the court. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The judge removed her glasses, looked directly at my family, and delivered her words like bullets. Based on the preliminary evidence, this court finds sufficient cause to proceed with all civil litigation and formally refers this matter for criminal investigation. She turned toward the federal representative seated in the gallery. The Department of Justice is to coordinate with the FBI and the Department of Defense Criminal Investigations Division immediately. My father stared forward, unmoving. My mother clutched her pearls like they could shield her from the truth now seared into public record. Tristan, the heir they had tried to elevate on my grave, visibly trembled, his face pale, his jaw slack. And then came the final act. The judge raised her gavel, her voice clear and firm. This court is adjourned pending criminal referral. The Ashford family will remain under federal scrutiny, effective immediately. The gavel fell. It didn't sound like wood striking wood. It sounded like a gunshot. The room didn't erupt. It deflated. The media outside would get their headlines. The military would begin its inquiry. But inside, in that solemn silence, I watched the dynasty that had tried to bury me collapse under the weight of its own deceit. Tell me, have you ever witnessed the exact moment power turns into ash? When the people who once sat above consequence realize the ground has vanished beneath them, I didn't need revenge to be loud. I just needed the truth to be louder. The aftermath wasn't explosive. It was controlled. Strategic. Ruthless in its efficiency. Just like everything my father used to pride himself on, except this time the strategy wasn't his. It was mine. Within 48 hours, federal investigators froze Ashford Industries' assets. Defense contracts were suspended pending review. Security clearances revoked. The media seized the story like sharks scenting blood, tearing apart the pristine image of a military family held up for decades as a symbol of honor. The name Ashford was no longer a badge, it became a stain. Tristan was the first to fall. The army wasted no time convening a court-martial. The evidence was overwhelming. Fraudulent commendation. Endangering lives during active training. Conduct unbecoming of an officer. The tribunal didn't blink. He was stripped of his rank, his medals rescinded in full view of the same cameras that had once broadcast his false heroism. They sentenced him to confinement at the U.S. disciplinary barracks at Fort Leavenworth. The boy they tried to turn into a legacy was now a prisoner behind federal bars. And still I felt nothing. No pride. No vengeance. Just a quiet certainty that the machine had finally stopped spinning. I watched the proceedings from a distance, sitting in Evelyn's office, the audio feed playing from her secure system. I didn't need to be in the room. My presence had already been felt. Then came my father, a man once feared by subordinates, respected by politicians, studied in military academies. The day after the hearing, he collapsed. A massive stroke, one that took his voice, his mobility, and what little remained of his dignity. He was moved to a private medical facility under quiet supervision. The press called it a tragic decline. I called it inevitability. I went to see him once. He sat in a wheelchair by a tall window overlooking a garden he didn't recognize. His eyes were vacant. His hands, once so firm and commanding, now shook faintly on his lap. I stood in silence for several minutes. Then, from my pocket, I pulled out his West Point class ring, the same one he had once worn like a crown. I set it gently on the table beside him. He didn't flinch. He didn't blink. I wasn't sure he even registered I was there. I didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. I left that room with a single truth in my chest: he would never understand the damage he caused. He had trained me to follow orders, to complete missions, to win. And I had done exactly that, but not for his legacy. For my survival. Tell me something: if the man who tried to erase you ended up erasing himself, would you feel triumph Or would you feel finally peace? Because I didn't walk out of that room victorious, I walked out clean. For the first time in my life, free of the need to prove anything to a man who never saw me as more than a flaw in his design. There was only one confrontation left. The architect of appearances. The woman who never lifted a hand but wielded her tongue like a scalpel. Serafina Ashford. My mother. After the court's ruling and the federal seizure of their assets, she had been placed under house arrest at the Milan estate. The same place where she'd smiled and offered me poisoned wine like it was communion. When I arrived, the estate no longer shimmered. It echoed. Rooms stripped of art. Furniture tagged with inventory markers. Federal agents moved like quiet shadows, documenting the collapse of a dynasty. The once pristine white columns of the house now looked like tombstones. And inside, Serafina waited. She was sitting in the drawing room wearing a silk robe that clung to old habits of control. Her hair still perfect. Her makeup deliberate. But her posture rigid, defensive, told me everything. She had heard the verdict. She had seen the headlines. But she hadn't accepted the truth. You've destroyed everything, she spat the moment I entered. Her voice, once refined and measured, now cracked under pressure. Everything we built. You were a curse on this family from the day you were born. She stood trembling with fury, pointing at the windows as if gesturing to ghosts. Do you have any idea what we sacrificed for you? I didn't flinch. I didn't argue. I let her scream. You should have disappeared quietly, she said through clenched teeth. You took everything from your brother. You humiliated your father. That was never your role. You were supposed to protect this family. That was your duty. And there it was, her truth. I stepped closer. My voice was low. Controlled. You still don't get it, do you? She froze. I wasn't the curse. I was the consequence. Her eyes widened. You taught me that love is earned through silence. That loyalty means obedience. That value is measured in how much pain you can carry for others' mistakes. You bred me for sacrifice and then called me selfish when I refused to die for you. I paused, letting the silence sting. You and Father taught me well. You said weakness was sentiment, that missions must be completed at any cost. So I followed your teaching to its logical end. I became the very thing you raised me to be. A weapon. But one you couldn't control. She shook her head, backing away as if seeing me for the first time. You wanted me silent, hidden, loyal. I chose to be loud, present, free. I walked to the mantel where a framed family portrait once sat. It was gone now, just dust and an outline on the wall. Fitting. I turned back to her one last time. For the record, I didn't destroy this family. You did. I just turned on the lights. Tell me, have you ever had to return to the very place that tried to erase you, just to let it see you still standing, not for closure, not for revenge, but for clarity? I didn't need her to understand. I just needed her to know she had lost. The war was over, but victory doesn't come with trumpets. It comes with silence. A silence so vast it forces you to ask yourself what remains after the noise fades. I left the Ashford estate that day without looking back. No parting words, no dramatic exit. Just the soft sound of gravel beneath my boots as I walked away from a life that had been built on lies, and nearly ended by them. Weeks later, I submitted my request for honorable discharge from the Army. Colonel Thorne processed it personally. When we met for the last time, it wasn't in a war room or a courtroom, but a small diner off Route 1. Coffee-stained menus, vinyl booths, a kind of peace I had never known in uniform. He slid a manila envelope across the table. New identification, bank access to the recovered trust fund, and legal confirmation that I was officially free. He didn't give a speech. Just a simple line, the kind only a soldier could say with weight. You've served enough. Now go live. I nodded. That night I packed what little I had and headed west. No destination in mind. Just a direction. Toward air that didn't smell like marble and politics. towards space that wasn't filled with echoes of obligation. I ended up in Montana, somewhere near Glacier National Park. I bought a small log cabin nestled against a tree line where the wind hums like memory, and the stars don't compete with city lights. For the first few weeks, I did nothing. Just breathed. Cooked simple food. Hiked. Watched the sun rise without checking the time. I learned how to sleep without one eye open. I learned how to read a book without underlining every sentence for meaning. Slowly, I began the hardest mission I'd ever undertaken, not revenge, not survival, but healing. One day, I visited the local animal shelter. A German shepherd older with graying fur and a limp caught my eye. The card said his name was Miller. Abandoned. Overlooked. I adopted him that same hour. He didn't ask for explanations. He just curled up beside me that night like we'd survived the same war. And in a way, we had. Evelyn sent me a package a month later. Inside was the Legion of Merit medal I thought I'd lost, and a handwritten note your honor was never in their hands to take. It was always yours. I placed it on the windowsill where the sunlight hits just right each morning. I didn't frame it. I didn't mount it. I just let it be a quiet reminder of who I had become. Tell me, have you ever stepped out of the identity the world forced on you and realized you didn't need to replace it? That maybe your true self was never missing, only buried? That's where I am now. I'm not Major Ashford, not the golden daughter, not the ghost in the cellar. I'm just Catherine, and for the first time, that's enough. If there's one truth I've learned, it's this. Sometimes the people who are supposed to love you the most are the very ones who try to bury you. But your worth isn't defined by their silence, their betrayal, or their absence. It's defined by how you rise. So to every parent who's built their empire on the back of one forgotten child, look again. You may not have raised a disappointment. You may have created a storm. Have you ever lived a version of this story, been cast aside, betrayed by blood? If so, share it in the comments. If this story meant something to you, like, subscribe and pass it on. Your voice matters. Thank you for listening.